Okay, and once again, good morning, everyone. Not a lengthy introduction this morning, just long enough to welcome you all back to part two of Victor Judge's The Pale Caste, the series in which we are studying Nella Larsen's book, Passing. I don't have any announcements in terms of upcoming events for Sunday mornings. July will be a quiet month for everybody. And then in August, we're looking at returning to the normal schedule of masses, which means that adult ed will take place in between the 8:30 memory jogs, the 8:30 and the 11 o'clock mass. And we're going to have that in person, but if you want the opportunity to participate online, do let me know. We don't have that hybrid set up yet. But if there's enough demand for people to be able to participate in our in-person sessions from the safety of their homes, I'm happy to work on that for you. And just one other plug, if anyone has been following along in our anti-racism reading group, we will be meeting this Tuesday at 7 p.m. on Zoom to discuss the book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma, and the Pathway to Mending Our Bodies and Hearts by Resma Menakem. And even if you haven't read this book, you are welcome to show up and learn. This is a very practical book. It's as much guided meditation and self-soothing exercises as it is theory. So even if you have a passing interest and haven't read the book, you're welcome to join us. And you can find more information about that on our website, ctk.org. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Victor. Thanks for being with us again.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see you on this Sunday morning. In last week's class, we were introduced to the African-American writer Nella Larsen, and with the publication on April the 26th, 1929, her second novel, Passing, confirmed that the 38-year-old writer indeed has a place among the African-American authors who emerged during the Harlem Renaissance. The title that I have given for this morning's lecture and discussion is Negotiating the Hyphenated Divide. And I'm referring to the way in which the identity African-American was written prior to 2019, when the Associated Press and the Academy agreed upon eliminating the hyphen that had been placed between African and American. When Nella Larsen is experiencing her renaissance among the literati, the scholarship that begins to develop around her canon employed that hyphen and inspired critics to think of that way of writing African-American in relationship to the epigraph with which the novel begins. We discussed in last week's class how Larsen chooses a verse from County Cullen's poem titled Heritage, a verse which in that poem is repeated twice. 3 centuries removed from the scenes his father loved. Spicy grove, cinnamon tree, what is Africa to me? Now, when one takes that excerpt from County Cullen's poem that serves as the epigraph for the novel, what one notices is that it consists of 2 couplets, one of which rhymes and one of which is a slanted in rhyme. Removed, loved. What is perhaps rhymed is the final letter D, what we call in writing a masculine rhyme, and then tree and me does rhyme. This slant rhyme, I think, very much represents the idea of this question that is asked, what is Africa to me? It's not an answer that is given easily in rhyme. It is much more ambiguous, much more complex. And that is what Nella Larsen shows to us in writing this novel. This long poem by County Cullen had appeared in his collection titled Color. And what's very interesting to note in the research of Larsen is that in her reading of County Cullen's volume, she did not respond all that favorably to his verses. However, upon consideration of the poem Heritage, in her understanding that the role of Africa and the African Americans' existence in a European influenced Western world would indeed perhaps serve her well in this novel, in which there is the role of culture and shaping one's identity very much brought into question. Cullen's poem and this epigraph evokes the difference between the often romantic image of historical connections with Africa, characterizing the Harlem Renaissance, and the stark reality of America Black writers' cultural distance from their African past. And I think that is suggested very much, as I was saying, by this slant rhyme within the two couplets comprising this excerpt. There is this juxtaposition between the romantic and the reality of an African American's cultural distance from an African past, and negotiating the hyphenated divide. This juxtaposition of past and present sets the stage for Larsen's bringing together long separated childhood friends and their two different cultures, neither of which draws directly or allusively upon Africa as an environmental place. Larsen answered the question posed by this epigraph in this tense narrative that explores racial identity, its arbitrary social construction, and its distinct devastating effect upon the individual. Passing depicts two light-skinned women from Chicago who had been friends during their childhood and who are intricately connected in responding to boundaries and boundlessness in their existence. Irene Westover is from a secure, middle-class African-American family, married to Brian Redfield, a successful physician and the mother of two sons. She is part of the privileged class in Harlem, where she enjoys social prominence and material comfort, but all within the boundaries of racially designated spaces for African Americans. The other woman, Claire Kendry, is the daughter of a custodian who drinks excessively and dies from the effects of a barroom fight. Reared by her father's white aunts, she has escaped a life of drudgery and entered a fluid, seemingly boundless state by marrying a wealthy white man, John Ballou, who assumes that she too is white. The narrative that we enter is devoted to establishing the levels of complicity and the differences between the personalities of the two women, the one who passes and the one aware of the deception. Though the perspective, as we shall see, is primarily that of Irene. We are taken into the interior monologues, into the inner consciousness of Irene, who becomes the primary narrator. She reflects upon and reacts to the reappearance of her once Black friend. And the internal worlds of the two characters are inextricably interconnected with their external worlds, and their physical appearances are reflections of their attitudes toward individuality, race, women of color, as well as projections of their bifurcated, their divided inner selves. This novel reads, does it not, like a story that is told in codes, that is told through gazes. And the story is very carefully constructed as this study of the psychology of an African-American woman, Irene, committed to middle-class values and ideals. What Larsen has done is to situate the female at the center of discourses on race and individuality, but in the demystifying of the woman of color, the racialized female, Passing insists that not everything about her or should be known. And so what Larsen has done by permitting herself as an artist to lean into ambiguity as she draws the portraits of Claire and Irene, what she has done for the health of the African-American female is to reveal the diversity and the complexity of the textures of African-American female life. And what she does is to reject any totalizing gender or race view, even though she explores the cultural conditions and the proscriptions that shape but do not determine the life of the female of color. She writes the novel in 3 movements. It reads very much like a play: encounter, re-encounter, and finale. And by structuring this novel accordingly in this verbal arrangement, what she does with the first movement, encounter, is to introduce the structure of replication and ritual returns. The novel begins in the narrative present, but immediately proceeds with the retrieval of memory as recounted from the gaze of Irene. In the opening scene, Irene Redfield receives a letter which is described to us as, and I quote, a thin, sly thing which bore no return address to betray the sender. And there was, too, something mysterious and slightly furtive about it, unquote. Because she has received a similar letter 2 years earlier, Irene recognizes not only the long envelope of thin Italian paper, the purple ink, and the foreign paper of extraordinary size, but also the almost illegible scrawl as belonging to Claire Kendry, whose handwriting is described as out of place and alien, furtive, but yet a little flaunting against the distinctive stationery. This letter that Irene receives sets the stage for Claire's own mysterious and furtive, bold, flaunting personality. It is as if the envelope with the writing and the paper becomes emblematic of Claire's character. It's as if we have in this opening scene, in this representation of the letter without the return address, this is when Larsen begins to draw, if you will, the portrait of Claire Kendry. So a written text is our point of access to the personal memory and to the construction of character. Irene's receipt of the letter immediately provokes her memory, seeing the handwriting, and associating this document with one which she has received 2 years earlier. This letter and the receipt of this document becomes a stimulus or a catalyst to a memory of Claire as a girl in Chicago, and evokes her recollection of the woman 2 years before, which is referred to as, and I quote, that time in Chicago. The words stood out from among the many paragraphs of other words, bringing with them a clear, sharp remembrance in which even now, after 2 years, the character Irene remembers the humiliation, the resentment, and the rage from that encounter in Chicago 2 years earlier. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the first movement recount for us this prolonged memory of those past events, which begins with the signal of Irene as the interpreter of that past experience. The narrator says, "This is what Irene Redfield remembered." And it's at this point in the narrative that we shift into the perspective of Irene and how it's through her eyes, through her gaze, through her casting back upon this experience that the narrative will proceed. And the second movement, as we shall see next week, re-encounter, and the final movement, finale, really become the way that Larsen is working out Irene's personal memory and her flawed interpretation in order to achieve meaning in the present. And what we also are able to discern as readers, because this memory is recounted from the perspective of Irene, we have to remember that Irene is first and foremost a narrator with limited omniscience, and that the memory will perhaps be revealed to us with her bias, with her prejudices. And so she cannot be believed to be this reliable narrator, because in shifting from an outside third person limited omniscient narrator into the limited omniscience of Irene, what Larsen has done is to present to us a character who, in assuming the role of narrator, is one that we always have to question, because we are taken into her interiority. And she is indeed, we learn, to be one who is concerned about place and order. Among the recurring words associated with Irene are fixity and stasis. And this encounter with Claire is a conceivable threat to her sense of place. We know that her husband, Brian, the physician, has aspirations to go to Brazil, whereby he can escape the racism that even he experiences, even though he has become a professional, has assumed a place in the discipline of medicine. He still experiences the racism of New York. And going to Brazil, where perhaps he will not be subjected to that racism, that becomes very much a threat to Irene. And then the second threat that is introduced is this encounter in movement 1 with Claire Kendry. And at the end of the first movement, we learn that Irene believes that she has to, if you will, edit Claire from her life. But at the same time, she perceives Claire as a threat. There is that which is also rather attractive to her. The boldness, the boundlessness, the fluidity with which she moves is the antithesis of the status quo that Irene is trying to preserve. And so we find Irene as well having to negotiate the hyphenated space, if you will, in an effort to preserve her sense of place and to avoid becoming displaced. She and Claire meet in the bright afternoon of a Chicago rooftop cafe, and the weather is oppressive on this particular day. What is happening in the exterior landscape, the tension, the heat, Larsen will figuratively relocate within the relationship of these two women in this encounter. They meet at the fashionable Drayton Hotel, which is modeled by Larsen on the Drake Hotel and the Morrison Hotel in Chicago. The Drake Hotel, which was located on the Gold Coast end of Michigan Avenue and Walton Place at Lakeshore Drive, and the Morrison Hotel, then in the Loop at Madison and Clark Street, was known for its Terrace Garden restaurant. These are among Chicago's most elegant and exclusive dining and dancing places. And in the outdoor world of Chicago's white smart set, the two passing women of color from the South Side do not initially recognize each other because they have both escaped the spatial boundaries imposed by the racial segregation of the city. But when they place each other within the context of race, they travel backward into the morning world of their youth in Chicago, where, though of different socioeconomic and class backgrounds, they share the experience of what it means to grow up urban, female, and Black. Light-skinned Irene Westover Redfield is reared in middle-class comfort in Chicago. Irene recognizes that she wants security more than anything else in life, and that her greatest satisfaction lies in her having married a person of professional status, Brian, and her sons, Brian Jr. and Ted. She has sacrificed her own self for this complacent absorption in family, security, the most important and desired thing in life. She wanted only to be tranquil, to be allowed to direct for their own good the lives of her sons and husband. In her own way, Irene is selfish and determined, but she is motivated by her conception of the ideal family and her own self-importance in actualizing the ideal. She admits that she is unwilling to take risk, either with her own future or that of her sons. Irene will not consider a move to Brazil, which Brian desires. She believes that their lives are secure and that they are too well established in Harlem to seek any intangible freedom in a foreign country. Feeling safe in her life of class privilege, servants, bridge parties, charity balls, and smart fashion, she views change of any sort as threatening. But her fears, however, reflect her absorption of a patriarchal culture. Her attention to her father, to her husband, to her sons, it both shapes and displaces her sense of self, of her possibilities, of her potential, of her value, of her worth. Her discontented husband longs for a different life on another continent, and her pampered sons want knowledge of life beyond the narrow restrictions that she imposes upon them. Brian is dissatisfied with life in the United States because he desires, as I was saying earlier, freedom from the racism that impinges upon his existence, despite his relatively insulated profession and status in the African American community. His placid exterior has begun to wear thin, and this gives Irene cause to fear. That old fear with strength increased, the fear of the future. And try as she might, she could not shake it off. It was as if she had admitted to herself that against that easy surface of her husband's concordance with her wishes, which had covered an increasing inclination to tear himself and his possessions from their proper setting, she was helpless. And so all Irene can do in an effort to come to terms with this fear, she assuages her fear by reminding herself that Brian is fond of her and loves her in what is described as a slightly undemonstrative way. We know as readers that this fear of displacement is one that has already been experienced by Irene. And now enter Act 1, Scene 2, Claire Kendry, who becomes then another threat to her sense of place. Claire enters, passing for white, as Mrs. John Bellew. She enters Irene's life and reveals that she has been, still is, and willing to risk anything in order to have whatever she wants. The way that Claire is described, her character, her disposition becomes somewhat distilled in the gerund having, that desire to have. And she is seemingly even-tempered and pleasant, but she has a having nature, which is evident through her face, which is described as an ivory mask, not white, not black, but ivory. And wearing the mask, performing a part that is not thought to be her real self. She performs like an actor who passes on the stage wearing a mask. She is performing this role of the white American married to a successful financier. But yet, even though she is playing this part, we also know that what she really wants as well is the company of African American whom she misses and whom her husband loathes. John Bellew uses racial slurs, epithets. They come very easily in his speech. He uses them freely without any filter, dismisses all of African Americans in this stereotype of scrimmy black devils, unaware that he is in the company of three such devils who are taking tea, and he enters and begins to speak in this unbridled series of racial slurs. And we have to think about that. Claire is certainly aware that he is this unmitigated racist. His entire identity is predicated upon this sense of white supremacy. And yet she brings two of her friends into a setting which they will be the direct objects of this virulent rant from this racist. And we have to ask ourselves the question, what does that say about Claire? That she would place her friends in such a compromising position, assuming that they will not in any way speak or defend themselves, that they become the direct objects of his racism and have to become so humiliated. So it's really interesting when we think about Claire. Does Claire really pass? Or is she more parading? Is she more performing? Because at the same time that she has secured this place in this performance, we also know that there is this pull, this question tugging at her. And I think it's the question in County Cullen's poem, Heritage. What is Africa to me? It's as if her continuing to go to the South Side as a young girl when she is in the custody of her white aunts, or when she wants to be with Irene as a way to be in the company of African Americans. The question is, has she really passed? Or is it more of a performance or of a parading? And whereas Irene's identity is circumscribed by this ideal conception of the proper family, Claire is also the mother of a daughter, and she thinks nothing of jeopardizing her marriage by renewing her friendship with Irene, by visiting the Redfields' home, by socializing in Harlem. She seems on the verge of renouncing her position as this wealthy white matron and accept life as a person of color, and possibly taking her friend's husband as a mate. You know, Claire is described as having the kinetics or the movement of a cat. She moves with confidence and courage in two worlds. She is, one might say, negotiating the hyphen. She has retained her ability to secure the things she wanted in the face of opposition, that having nature. About her, there was some quality, hard and persistent, with strength and endurance of rock that could not be beaten or ignored. Claire is an aggressive individual who seeks self-satisfaction without the timidity society instills in females. And despite the existence of Marjorie, her 10-year-old daughter, she does not elevate the needs of her family above her own having nature. As she says, children aren't everything. There are other things in the world, unquote. Neither does she allow the deprivations of her childhood to damage her adult life. She accepts her unhappy formative years, but does not allow the past to define her, to determine her chances for individual happiness and fulfillment. She has daring, nerve. She is self-absorbed. The narrator says there is nothing sacrificial in Claire Kendry's idea of life. No allegiance beyond her immediate desire, selfish, cold, and hard. Yet, we also know that Claire has a strange capacity of transforming warmth and passion, verging sometimes almost on theatrical heroics, unquote. And I think that detail that we are told as readers about Claire's nature, that she can transform warmth and passion, verging sometimes almost on theatrical heroics, we have to give attention to that figuration, because I think it supports the claim that instead of passing, she is still in the stage of performing. She is still parading in her life. In passing for white, in assuming this Caucasian identity by putting on the pale mask, she has escaped deprivation and dependence upon her two very unsympathetic white aunts, who are unaware that she has married into the white world of wealth and security. And after recognizing that she requires more than money and security for happiness, Claire returns secretly to the African-American community through her connection with her childhood friend, Irene Redfield. The escape from her deeply religious white aunts is the passage that I would like for us to turn our attention to now, especially for our purposes of reading this novel as a work of literary theology, because it is in this particular moment that we learn about Claire's childhood. And even though it is a very brief description, what is embedded in this particular excerpt, I think, is Larsen's commentary on good Christian people. There's a wonderful ambiguity, however, which Larsen as writer is insistent upon showing. Yes, the two white aunts take Claire into their custody and provide for her a home. And Claire acknowledges that provision and wonders what life she would have had she not been taken into their custody. But at the same time that she is provided a home, she is still treated, although she is blood relation, although she is the niece of these aunts, in their home, she becomes, does she not, a servant. And it's really, I would argue, Maureen, a variation on indentured servitude. As a child, she will have this period of servitude, and then when she turns the legal age of 18, she will run away and marry John Ballou, who believes she is white. And they will leave. They will not return to this setting. And she will never have to explain her relatives to him. But this scene is one that I would argue really becomes the way in which Larsen writes and shows this ambiguity of good Christian people. What she also brilliantly reveals to us is the misinterpretation, the very poor exegesis that has regretfully prevailed in the story of Noah's nakedness and his son Ham seeing him in his nakedness. So I want us to devote our attention, if we may, to that. If you were reading from the Penguin edition, the excerpt that I want us to explicate begins at the bottom of page 25. Irene reminded herself that she ought immediately to go, but she didn't move. The truth was, she was curious. She wished to find out about this hazardous business of passing, this breaking away from all that was familiar and friendly, to take one's chance in another environment, not entirely strange, perhaps, but certainly not entirely friendly. What, for example, one did about background, how one accounted for oneself, and how one felt when one came into contact with other Negroes. But she couldn't. She was unable to think of a single question that in its context or its phrasing was not too frankly curious, if not actually impertinent. As if aware of her desire and her hesitation, Claire remarked thoughtfully, "You know, Reen, I've often wondered why more colored girls, girls like you and Margaret Hammer and Esther Dawson and lots of others never passed over. It's such a frightfully easy thing to do. If one's the type, all that's needed is a little nerve." What about background? Family, I mean. Surely you can't just drop down on people from nowhere and expect them to receive you with open arms, can you? Almost, Claire asserted. You'd be surprised, Reen, how much easier that it is with white people than with us. Maybe because there are so many more of them, or maybe because they are secure and so don't have to bother. I've never quite decided. Irene was inclined to be incredulous. You mean that you didn't have to explain where you came from? It seems impossible. Claire cast a glance of repressed amusement across the table at her. As a matter of fact, I didn't. Though I suppose under any other circumstances, I might have had to provide some plausible tale to account for myself. I've a good imagination, so I'm sure I could have done it quite creditably and credibly. But it wasn't necessary. They were my aunts, you see, respectable and authentic enough for anything or anybody. I see. They were passing too? No, they weren't. They were white. Oh, and in the next instant, it came back to Irene that she had heard this mentioned before by her father, or more likely, her mother. They were Bob Kendry's aunts. He had been a son of their brothers on the left hand, a wild oat. Now, stopping at that interval, Bob Kendry, Claire's father. His father was white, his mother African American. But because of the circumstances of this union, because this would have been recognized as an act of miscegenation, the offspring of such a union would not be allowed to inherit any of the father's fortune or possessions, nor would the Black mother. But what I want to emphasize here, I think, is quite subtle on the part of Larsen. We are going to be told that these are good Christian aunts. But notice, if you will, the way in which Bob Kendry's identity has been circumscribed for him. And the first reference, he had been a son of their brothers on the left hand, a wild oat. And a wild oat is, first of all, presented to us as a fragment, not as a complete declarative sentence. Now, what's noteworthy here, Essie, is that the identity of Claire's father is first referred to in a euphemism. And we know that euphemisms are very polite figurations or turns of phrases that will not in any way embarrass us in conversation. Having grown up in the South, I have a repertoire of euphemisms. In my small town, we once had a scandal. There was an outbreak of venereal disease, but my grandmother referred to it euphemistically as the social sickness, never using the precise language. Here he is referred to as a son on the left hand, as opposed to on the right hand. And the right hand is it not, always associated with a place of privilege. One sits at the right hand of God, but he is on the left hand, which suggests to us, Mary Lou, that he is one that doesn't have a place in the economy of proper society. And then referred to euphemistically and fit in terms of writing in a fragment, a wild oat. He's not even referred to fully anthropomorphically. He is referred to in synecdoche on the left hand. And the synecdoche is merely a part of the whole. And then to refer to as inanimate, as the seed of another man sowing his wild oats. He is the seedling, the wild oat. The absence of the anthropomorphic, the absence of the whole. This has been the way that Bob Kendry's identity has been circumscribed for him in these polite euphemisms. They were nice old ladies, Claire explained, very religious and as poor as church mice. That adored brother of theirs, my grandfather, got through every penny they had after he'd finished his own little bit. Claire paused in her narrative to light another cigarette. Her smile, her expression, Irene noticed, was faintly resentful. Being good Christians, she continued, when Dad came to his tipsy end, they did their duty and they gave me a home of sorts. I was, it was true, expected to earn my keep by doing all the housework and most of the washing. But do you realize, Reen, that if it hadn't been for them, I shouldn't have had a home in the world? Irene's nod and little murmur were comprehensive, understanding. Claire made a small, mischievous grimace and proceeded. Besides, to their notion, hard labor was good for me. I had Negro blood, and they belonged to that generation that had written and read long articles headed, Will the Blacks Work? Too, they weren't quite sure that the good God hadn't intended the sons and daughters of Ham to sweat because he had poked fun at old man Noah once when he had taken a drop too much. I remember the aunts telling me that that old drunkard had cursed Ham and his sons for all time. Irene laughed, but Claire remained quite serious. It was more than a joke, I assure you, Reen. It was a hard life for a girl of 16. Still, I had a roof over my head and food and clothes, such as they were. And there were the scriptures and talks on morals and thrift and industry and the loving kindness of the good Lord. Have you ever stopped to think, Claire, Irene demanded, how much unhappiness and downright cruelty are laid to the loving kindness of the Lord, and always by his most ardent followers, it seems? Have I, Claire exclaimed. They made me what I am today. For of course, I was determined to get away, to be a person and not a charity or a problem or even a daughter of the indiscreet Ham. Then too, I wanted things. I knew I wasn't bad looking and that I could pass. You know, Reen, how when I used to go over to the South Side, I used almost to hate all of you. You had all the things I wanted and never had. It made me all the more determined to get them and others. Can you understand what I felt? Now, stopping at that interval. Being good Christians, they did their duty and gave me a home of sorts. I was, it was true, expected to earn my keep by doing all the housework and most of the washing. But do you realize, Reen, that if it hadn't been for them, I shouldn't have had a home in the world? This is the ambiguity which I was referring earlier, in which Larsen will permit herself as a writer to enter. Good Christians who fulfill their duty as aunts of this child who is the offspring of the wild oat on the left hand. But I think we have to ask ourselves, do we not, the question, to what degree can the adoption of this 16-year-old dependent really be considered charitable or good works? Because attached to this taking in of Claire is that she becomes a domestic. She becomes a servant, doing all the washing, earning her keep, and she is forbidden to associate with Negroes. So she enters into this isolated existence, and it's a life of servitude. Now, I think what's also very noteworthy here is what Larsen is showing us and suggesting to us about these two good Christian aunts. When Claire says, to their notion, hard labor was good for me, that they can justify having her do all the washing and earning her keep, that this is justifiable, that hard labor is good for her. I had Negro blood, and they belong to that generation that had written and read long articles headed, "Will the Blacks Work?" And we can only imagine what that essay would have entailed. It was perhaps, I think we're able to infer that it would be this treatise on the actual work ethic of the African American, or is it a master required to ensure that the work is done, an overseer, if you will. But at the same time that there is such a contradiction here between the grammar of the Gospels and the grammar that the two aunts embrace, Claire does indeed see them in their context. Yes, this has been a very difficult chapter in her life, but she will not permit it to define her solely. She acknowledges the context of the aunts, saying that they are of a generation that would have read such documents, John, that reinforce their prejudicial views, one could argue. But there is also that part of Claire that can see them charitably in their context. And this sentence here, they weren't quite sure that the good God hadn't intended the sons and daughters of Ham to sweat because he had poked fun at the old man Noah once when he had taken a drop too much. Now, embedded in that excerpt of Claire's speech is a double negative. They weren't quite sure that the good God hadn't intended. Well, weren't quite sure that God hadn't intended, suggesting perhaps they're more inclined to believe that God intended this. Telling me that the old drunkard had cursed Ham and his sons for all time. The aunts see her as charity, as problem, as a daughter of the indiscreet Ham. And Claire will not permit herself, Joe, to allow that to define her. And what's also noteworthy is what we are able to infer by this misinterpretation of the 9th chapter of the book of Genesis allows us to infer what the ants have heard from the pulpit of the services they would have attended over their lives. Genesis 9 recounts how God blesses Noah and Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, after the flood, reiterating the blessing given in Eden to be fruitful, multiply, and populate the earth. And Noah plants a vineyard and overindulges in the fruit of his labor in the vineyard, becomes inebriated, and lies uncovered in his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, sees his father's nakedness and tells his brothers, who respectfully cover their father while diverting their gaze. When Noah awakens from his stupor, he condemns Ham's behavior, saying, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Now, it is quite surprising, Mike, how this narrative, which is so very lean in detail, if you will, has been so consequential in race history. In the 19th century, the curse of Ham was used to justify the enslavement of Black Africans on the grounds that they are the descendants of Ham. You know, this racialized version of the curse of Ham. And what the ants have been subjected to, I would argue, is a very impoverished exegesis of this event from the 9th chapter of Genesis. It is not God who curses Ham and the descendants of Canaan. It is Noah. It is the father. Shem, Ham, and Japheth are the sons of Noah. They do not represent different races. But this racialized version of the curse of Ham has suited ideologically economical interests of the European elite and the slave traders who wish to justify the exploitation of African labor. This racialized version of the curse to justify slavery, to justify a racial hierarchy, to justify racial superiority. It grows out of a particular strain of European anthropology. It does not emerge from a sound exegesis of the biblical text. Those who want to establish a biblical foundation or basis for racial superiority suggest that God had sanctioned the curse of Ham, and by extension, all those descended from him would be relegated to slavery. It is Noah who curses, and we have no evidence in the text that God sanctions the curse of Noah upon Ham. And so this misinterpretation of this scene, and it's a very lean scene in Scripture, has become, if you will, exponential in justifying the enslavement of those who do not fit into the classification of a European anthropology. And because the ant's brother has intimate relations with an African-American woman, from which there is then the wild oat of the left hand, Claire has imposed upon her this identity of a cursed descendant of Ham, and therefore they are justified in having her do all the washing and live a life of servitude. What else is revealed to us that I find most curious is the way that the ants refer to the indiscretion of their brother. Claire says, the ants were queer. For all their Bibles and praying and ranting about honesty, they didn't want anyone to know that their darling brother had seduced, ruined, they called it, a Negro girl. They could excuse the ruin, but they couldn't forgive the tar brush. They forbade me to mention Negroes to the neighbors or even to mention the South Side. You may be sure that I didn't. I'll bet they were good and sorry afterwards. She laughed, and the ringing bells in her laugh had a hard, metallic sound. Now, consider the way that the ants, how very prejudiced they are in referring to their brother's indiscretion. He has not seduced, he has ruined, they call it, a Negro girl. Now, if the ants think that he has ruined her, that seems, does it not, to contradict their attitude and their treatment of the offspring of this ruination. And I think it's also very noteworthy, Barbara, that it's referred to as a ruining. And that has such, does it not, such very negative connotations, this ruination. I think perhaps they refer to it as a ruining as opposed to a seduction. Seduction might not be as polite a word as the more formal, somewhat grand idea of ruination. But the implication of ruination is that there is no possibility, there is no hope. It's a very, very fatalistic noun, is it not? Ruined. As if there is nothing that can be redeemed from this, that there's no hope whatsoever. It's such a very drastic, fatalistic noun. And they could excuse the ruin. They couldn't forgive the tar brush. Forgiveness of the good Christian white ants. They can excuse the indiscretion. They can excuse the act that the brother has committed, the ruin. What they cannot forgive is the tar brush. Left hand, wild oat, tar brush. What is a primary concern is not that a woman's virtue has been taken from her, not that a woman has been dishonored, that a woman has been violated. It's the fact that she is an African American. They can overlook the indiscretion. They can be very selective in what they are willing to forgive, a selective forgiveness, if you will. What they cannot forgive is that the indiscretion involved a woman of color. That, I think, suggests, Mary Lou, a very misguided set of principles and Christian virtues. Selective forgiveness. We're past the hour, so I think it's important at this time that I invite questions and comments.
Victor, this is Mary Lou. I have a couple of questions.
Please.
first, from the scene on Drayton's rooftop, there's some notes from Irene that she fears that the woman staring at her will be staring at her because she's Negro.
Yes.
Which I found fascinating, because she's actually, in her own way, does her own passing.
Yes.
And so that to me was fascinating. And secondly, let me just raise my other question. I had a question about the function of Gertrude in this, who in many ways is a little of each of them. But so if you could comment on both of those things.
Sure, I'm happy to, Mary Lou. Let me begin with the role of Gertrude, who is brought into this setting by the producer, director, lead actor, Claire. And I think you're right in seeing her, Mary Lou, as somewhat of negotiating the hyphen as well. The reader's attention is drawn to the way that she is attired, that her clothes, in contrast to Claire and to Irene, are rather ill-fitting. And there are attempts on her part to try to excuse herself, but cannot find the proper moment to make her egress from this stage. I think you're very much on point, Mary Lou, by seeing her as one who is perhaps a distillation of both of these women. The scene that your first question about Irene at the Drayton, taking respite from the August heat. She has passed into a space that is reserved for white clientele. She asks to be seated near the window where it's quieter, where she will not be in the line of view of anyone's attention. And then, after securing her place on the stage, if you will, enter Claire, not with her husband, but with another man. And Claire's entrance is extremely dramatic. She comes in all of these floral colors. She's almost like this force of spring that comes in or intrudes in the heat of this August day. She's described first as movement, as motion, before she assumes physical form. And does that answer your question, Mary Lou, as well? And that's in direct contrast, if you will. This is where your question leads me to another point, in that that's our first image of Claire in the present. But we are taken back in the memory to Claire as a young girl who is sitting on the sofa, sewing together fragments of red fabric to make a dress for the Sunday picnic, a dress so that she will not feel embarrassed in the company of other individuals. That scene of her in the opening, in that earliest recollection of her, sitting on the sofa, and as her father begins to bellow out all of these curses going up and down the room, she moves farther and farther down the sofa to the very end and secures herself there as her father begins to curse in this state of inebriation. But we first see her holding fragments of material of one color, which is quite the opposite of how we meet her when she makes her entrance in the Drayton as this force coming into this intense August heat and the situation itself becoming very intense.
Victor, my question is about Irene, who it reflects on Claire staring at her and saying, somehow did this, before her eyes, did they see her as Negro?
Yes.
So, and then later she says, never when she was alone had they even remotely seemed to suspect she was a Negro. No, the woman there staring at her couldn't possibly know. And so you get a sense that Irene has known passing too, has known, denying her own color, which, I found myself reflecting back on, because you don't hear that as you go forward, at least in the next section.
Well, the fact that when she is taken to the Drayton by the driver, never does she hesitate making her entrance into this white establishment. So that is a safe inference that you could make, Mary Lou, in that she has on occasion passed. And let's keep in mind that the African American community in which Irene is situated, in which she is located, is one of prominence and professionalism. Right. It is not South Side. It is a community of professionals, and she does work with different organizations, but she is in an administrative role within those organizations as well. So yes, I think she has passed. We see her passing into the Drayton, although she does, Mary Lou, want to be seated apart from people where perhaps she will not come under their scrutiny. But the reason I would argue that she's also very resistant to the idea of going to Brazil is she can't pass there. Does that stand to reason, Mary Lou?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But I think there's such a wonderful contrast between our first description of her in the memory of her sitting withdrawn against the edge of a sofa, holding fragments of a material, of a monochromatic of the same color, having to make her own dress for a church social. And then when we actually see her in the present, she is not even described in terms of a physical anatomy initially. She is a force. She moves in like the wind, if you will, in this fusion of spring floral colors in a very fashionable dress, the exact opposite of one that she would have had to have made for herself. And to make this dress, we learn that she has to take part of her own wages and buy her own fabric. So, it is a life of deprivation. But I must say this, to Claire's credit, and I think this is a part of her strength, she will not allow this to define her as a victim. Other comments or questions?
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point, though you're all welcome to stay.
I hope this has made some semblance of meaning. It's I just, this is the one reference that we have to religion, to Christianity, and what we're able to infer from it. About the aunt's good Christianity, I think, and I say that to the credit of Larsen. She doesn't preach, she doesn't tell, she allows the reader to infer based upon the action of the character. Character is revealed through action. And we are able to make these intelligent inferences based on the action that Larsen recounts in this scene.